No, that's a critical issue. Take us to Kenya, your period as South Africa's ambassador there. I would be interested in, of course, you served as South Africa's ambassador, but right on the doorstep there's the Somalia conflict. Take us into your experience as South Africa's ambassador. Remember, when you're an ambassador, you're actually de facto the head of state. You're here de facto, which, for example, can, and I know it's a bit theoretical, but it can theoretically include the power to declare war, for example.
It does, Dr. P. That's why
so this man here could have declared war at some point in time.
That's why they call ambassadors plenipotentiary and extraordinary. The plenipotentiary, it means you have the powers of the president to declare war. But my experience in Kenya, coming to Kenya, is totally different. It was very interesting as a diplomat. Kenya was beset by challenges internally. You would recall at that stage, President Moi had been in power for long. I think he took over from President Kenyatta.
This is now early mid-2000s, 2005.
I arrived in Kenya on the 1st of April, which was my birthday, 1st of April 2001.
Okay.
That's when I arrived in Kenya. But at that time, there were discussions around the Somali conflict and so on. And because of the respect that Kenyans and Somalis had for South Africa, I was roped in behind the scene to assist in the negotiations. And at that stage, I got exposed to a host of role players in Kenya. And as a diplomat, I never confined myself to a particular group. I reached out even to warlords that were running Mogadishu. They divided Mogadishu into five areas. And Mogadishu was divided along clans line. Some of the warlords that were there, that I developed good friendship with them. And they were able to develop this friendship, not because of me, but because of the respect they had for the country. And I was there representing the country. And we were able, as a country, to try to help the negotiation process that was going on. In Kenya, they then started this discussion in the north, in Eldoret, and it involved a lot of warlords. I remember I was called to a meeting at one stage to drive to the northern Kenya because some of the warlords were threatening to leave. The war had flared up in Mogadishu while they were trying to settle and have a negotiated settlement in Eldoret. And I went to a meeting with a guy that I later developed a great deal of respect. He was one of the warlords that used to run Mogadishu. When I arrived there, he was threatening to leave because he was intimidated. But we managed to sit down and convince him to stay and continue with the negotiations. The president of the transitional arrangement at that time, he passed on now, Abdullahi Ismail, who we actually tried to help as a country because he had a serious... I remember
he had quite an influence at the time.
He had a serious heart problem, and we, at one stage, we had to fly him to the United Kingdom to go and get a treatment and to come back and stay the course of the negotiations. So as a country, we're investing a lot in terms of persuading warring factions in Mogadishu.
Dr. Makhubela, can I pause there for a moment? You know, this is very interesting what you're sharing with us. You know, myself, my career, I've also worked a lot on peace and security in Africa, and I've seen a lot of commentary and analysis on South Africa. And oftentimes people make this comment, yes, we are in the DRC in peacekeeping, yes, but what does South Africa actually do in mediation? Here you are sharing with us a real story, a real nuts and bolts story of how you as a South African ambassador, being trusted by both parties, get involved behind the scenes and you actually facilitate tremendously important processes. It's fascinating.
And remember, our foreign policy is still anchored on building a better South Africa and a better Africa and a better world. So we realize that a prosperous Africa, it's a prosperous South Africa. We cannot be a sea of stability amidst conflict that we're going on. So that was our focus in terms of trying to help resolve the conflict. One of the issues that during the presidency of President Beki, that was undertaken by the government was to try to assist in the resolution of conflicts in the country. And we were trying at the Department of Foreign Affairs to try to build pockets of excellence in terms of diplomats within the institution to assist in the resolution of conflicts around the country. And it so happened that the area where I was accredited was a conflict area. It was a conflict that was going on in Somalia, the conflict going on in Ethiopia, the conflict that is going on in Uganda. So that area was beset by conflicts. East Africa, there was a conflict that was going on in Rwanda, a conflict that was going on in the DRC. So all that area was beset by conflicts. So we got involved in that to try to assist. But my focus area was around the Somalis. And the Somali conflict is quite, there's what it's called the Karamoja conflict belt that stems across from Ethiopia. It runs into Somalia, right into Uganda, because that Karamoja conflict belt has a serious proliferation of small arms. And the small arms, some of them find themselves into criminal activities. Some of them find themselves into ethnic rivalries. I mean, there's a very interesting thing about Kenya to learn. There are tribes within the Kalenjin. The Kalenjin is a bigger tribe. There's Marakwet, Nandis. But there's been a tradition of paying dowry. And that every August, September, people will go and steal cattle from one family to go and pay dowry. And later on, it'll be stolen. And
so you don't deplete your own hand.
They kept on moving around like that. But the proliferation of small arms into those communities then started to change the dynamics of the conflict.
Very interesting, Dr. Makhubela. Maybe for our viewers also, and I think what you are relaying to us now is a real blind spot story. Because I think, let's quickly pause for a moment. Let's look at Somalia, 1990-91. There's Siad Barre, the last president of Somalia. There are certain events that happened, but basically say from 1991 onwards, we have a total collapse or basically an evaporation of the state. Imagine now South Africans, you wake up in a year's time and there is, I mean, absolutely no state. There is no post office, there is no home affairs, there is no nothing that you can go to. What replaces that then? That is what you are talking about. But you're talking about in your time, 2001 to then, that's already a decade after the collapse of the state. So what you encountered is an environment where warlords, clan militias, and bigger political organizations that are armed control the economy, society, the streets, everything. It's a bit like Thomas Hobbes. You know, if you go into your political philosophy or political theory, Thomas Hobbes, when he writes about the state of nature, it's like the state creates an environment that's stabilized. There's no warlords running around, theoretically. Now, Somalia is basically a state of nature, if you look at it in Thomas Hobbes' terms. The reason I raise that is maybe for the bigger blind spot we're talking about, is we assume we live in a world where the state is the norm. And is it? Is the state the norm? Like the case of Somalia. Clearly, it's not.
The international system, Dr. P, it's built around state system. And the state system is still regarded as a source of peace and prosperity. The Somali state actually has seen unprecedented state collapse. It has never happened before anywhere. I think it's starting to happen now in Libya, in Yemen. But Somalia was the first state where the state totally disintegrated. Not only collapsed, it disintegrated.
Completely.
And in the wake of state, a small groups of clan-aligned businesses started to emerge and run the country.
It's actually a good way of putting it. It is like a business, you know.
Exactly. People started to depend on that. And militias were recruited along clans line because militias were protecting their own clans mate and so on. So that's how it was created. But it's unprecedented to have a state to totally collapse and disintegrate. If you look at the history of state failure and collapse, you realize that the state will be boxed into the capital. And that's a remnant of the state will remain in the capital. But outside the capital, there's no state that would
a bit
have
like
any
the
control.
Democratic Republic of Congo to some extent.
Same as the Congo. Mobutu remained in charge of Kinshasa. At the same time, when Kuguno Day and so on were having serious conflict, in the Central African Republic, the state was boxed to N'Djamena.
Exactly.
And because it was only in N'Djamena, you build, and the theory and how the state has been functioning, once it collapses and it's confined to the capital, it will start the inward-outward building of the capacity. But Somalia is the only state that even the capital, no one has a single ownership of the state.
Yeah.
That's why Mogadishu was divided,
Yes.
was controlled by the main dominant warlords at that time, was Mohammed Dere, was Mohammed Khanyere, Ali Osmanato, Musa Sudi, Omar Finish, and Hussein Aidid's son. So those were people who actually divided Mogadishu into different areas. But the irony of it is that those who control the port would allow their rival militias to clear their things through the port of Mogadishu. But they would pay tax for it.
Exactly.
And they would function. Even the arms would be cleared at the port of entry, though they are going to war with each other. So money was very instrumental
Somalia,
and central.
of course,
to that.
has a massive coastline. When you look at
There's a massive coastline. I mean, it's the biggest coastline in the African continent, bigger than us actually.
Around the whole of Africa. Yeah.
And actually, a lot of people don't understand that we have the migration of the tuna fish between Somalia and South Africa. The movement of tuna, it moves between Somalia and South Africa. So that's why when you see a lot of pirate ships around the area and this illegal fishing, clearing even smallest marine, there's a direct impact on us in the long run because that migration of tuna fish between the two countries has been very fundamental for the livelihood of us.
This is fascinating, Dr. Makhubela, because if you then look at that constellation of the collapse, the total disappearance of a state and what replaces it, now, you mentioned that, and that's actually something that I thought of asking you. If we now start casting the net a bit wider, then you do your PhD, which I think is a phenomenal piece of work at University of Pretoria. So, of course, also viewers, once again, Dr. Makhubela, Ambassador at Makhubela here, at the age of above 50, we're not talking age now, but above 50, this man completed his PhD. So it's not just a man of experience, he's a man of letters. And I have engaged with your study, and I think you did tremendous work there. And there's one very specific thing. You can talk to us in general a bit about your PhD work, because of course, now here's also a very important example. I think for anybody out there, I think Dr. Makhubela is also an example of somebody whose lived experience of being in Kenya, engaging in Somalia, ultimately feeds into his PhD work. It's phenomenal, really, to bring that real lived experience ultimately into the theoretical realm, of academia. So you did your PhD, and there's something very specific in your PhD that I'm very interested in, what you call third-generation militias. And I think there's a tremendous contribution you make there to the discourse on not just state collapse, but basically the discourse on insurgency, rebel movements, militias. Even if you go into South America, the environment where, say, in Colombia, or you get more your drug cartel movements, of course, drug cartels, but a drug cartel is ultimately just a militia on major steroids because they've got major money to arm themselves and to control territory. So here's the question then. That concept of third-generation militias, just talk to us about that comes out in your PhD, and maybe anything else from your PhD that you would like to share.
Dr. P, the contribution of the study, I really looked into the evolution of militia groups. The first generation of militias are militias that belong to the state. The state has militias. For instance, we had in this country the citizen force, the commandos. Those are first generation of militias that augment the function of the state, support the state. You then have the second generation of militias. Second generation of militias are created, for instance, in countries like the Congo, Brazzaville. We had the Lusuba and so on, militias, the ninjas and so on. Those are party militias that operate outside the state, but their intention, they contest to capture the state. The instrument of the state may be very weak, but the contestation is around capturing of the state. And I asked myself, the militias in Somalia, what do they do? Because there's no contestation of the state.
Yeah,
The instruments of the state
there
have
is
been
no
totally decimated. So this is what I call the third generation militias, because they operate in situations where you don't have a state. And it was the first time in Somalia. I mean, even in Afghanistan, when the whole Soviet army was moved, Kabul remained in control until the fall of Kabul. The same thing. When Mozambique took over, Lorenzo Marx was still standing. They had to storm Lorenzo Marx and eventually took it, because the contestation is around the last bastion of defense is the capital. Now, in the absence of any state and any form of governance around the capital, no one has a claim to it. That's where militias started to operate. And there's no state. You essentially have powerless militias fighting for power, and no one has power.
Each other, you know.
And that's why part of the challenges in Somalia is to create transitional government. Create a transitional government in Somalia and appoint a minister of tourism. In a country where the sources of state are not there, sources of power are not there.
There's no tax, there's no...
Nothing.
Yeah.
So if you speak about...
there's no law. What's
exactly,
the law?
a transitional government.
What is the law?
A transitional government, a coalition. There's the expectation of the dishing out of state patronage at the end. But there's no sources of that state patronage. And it keeps on perpetuating the conflict. And that's what I then came up with the idea of the third generation militias. Because if you look at the academic world, the study around militia behavior is very limited. It's confined to the first generation and second generation. So I expanded on the theory around the third generation militia groups. And I looked into other countries where this may be applicable, like Libya, like Yemen, because when Tripoli completely collapsed and Tripoli remained a contested area and the sources of power were taken away by different clan groups, and that's where this theory is applicable. That's the most extreme form of state disintegration and collapse.
Dr. Makhubela, I'm going to test an idea. Muammar Gaddafi comes to a fall. NATO R2P operation in Libya, Gaddafi dead. What happens in that time is something very interesting. Libya in the armed forces had a tremendous amount of Tuareg soldiers. Those Tuareg fled from Libya with their arms into Mali. What happens in Mali eventually? Mali gets split. That little foot of Mali remains, and the rest of Mali ultimately gets into Islamist Tuareg control. Now, the reason I mention that is, what you're saying there applies to the Sahel region, very much so. Because if you look at the Tuareg forces and the so-called Islamist forces that the French are still fighting, and the West Africans are still fighting in that part of the world, I think what you are talking about is directly applicable there as well.
It is applicable. I mean, if you look at the dynamics around the Tuareg, it involves a few countries in the Sahel area. And it's true, you remember even the son of Gaddafi went to Mali and left, was accommodated by the Tuareg tribesmen around the area. So the ethnicity plays a very important role, excuse me, in areas of state disintegration and collapse, because ethnicity is a driving force. And that's why part of the issues as you build the capacity of the state is to deal with the ethnic issues, the national issues. Create a serious integration of different ethnic groups into the state institution. Because if you don't do that, those become pressure points for any eventuality and to be used in any state collapse. So if you look at that, it's the same thing. If you go to Yemen, you find that it's the same kind of the tribal dynamics that are at play there. And this ethnicity, because it's used to infuse this conflict within the area, it becomes a huge problem. You look at the DRC, part of resolving the DRC challenges, it's around ethnicity. So ethnicity is becoming, it's an issue also even in Afghanistan. It's a big problem around ethnicity. So managing those nuances, it's so crucial. Somalia, ironically, appears to be very homogeneous in terms of the language. But the underlying clan and the lineage, I mean, Somali goes even to the patrilineage. That's how it goes. What it means if myself and my brother, I'm Kingsley, my brother is Romeo. Children of Romeo, they would belong to a total different subclan than children of Kingsley.
Yep.
That's how the division goes. Wow. And that's why if you want to look at the conflict in Somalia, you look at who are the forces that are at war with each other. And then you can appeal to the elders. The Somali system is so much anchored around the involvement of clan elders who are involved. So you can then try to find a solution. I always look at the conflict each time it flares, and I see people are not talking to the right people, and you know that this conflict would go on. But once you start talking to the clan elders, they will then be able to deal with that, because you then have to look at the lineage of the people involved in the conflict. Now, of course, ethnicity is always used as a source of conflict. People are not meant to be different forever, but these things are used in any conflict.